So let's improve authentication to our database. In Azure, something named a managed identity exists. That's a service principal, an identity if you wish, that's automatically managed by Azure, more specifically by Microsoft Entra ID. Microsoft Entra ID is Microsoft's identity and access management solution. It used to be called Azure AD or Azure Active Directory. It's the place where you would store the user accounts of the people in your company. But it's more than just that. One of the things it can be used for is managing these managed identities. Imagine you need to access something. In other words, you are a client. And you want access to something. That something is called a resource. In this case, you could look at the app service as the client and our SQL Server database on Azure as the resource the client wants to access. A typical thing to do to enable a scenario like this is to allow a client to get a token that can then be passed on to the resource the client wants to access, and at that level the token can be validated and checked to see whether access is allowed. The thing that generates those tokens, that in this case is Entra ID. So how does a client get access to a token then? Well, there's quite a few ways to achieve that. But in all of those, it comes down to the fact that the client will need to send a request to Entra ID with the necessary credentials. Typical things here are a client ID and a client secret that identify the client. Entra ID, which is the identity provider in this case, then checks those and responds with a token. That token will typically contain information about what level of access is now granted to the client. In this case, it should contain that access to the resource is granted to the client. So, when the client wants to access the resource, the token is sent, and at level of the resource, it's validated. That is, at high level, how this typically works. However, that approach means that you still need to manage those secrets, those passwords, and you will also need to store them somewhere where the client can access them. So, there's management issues here, and there's potential security issues here. Just imagine the case where the client doesn't safely store the secret. That is where managed identities come in. Managed identities simplify this process by eliminating the need to store secrets in your code or configuration files, like a password or a connection string. Managed identities simplify all of this by eliminating the need to store secrets in your code or in configuration files, like a password in a connection string. The secrets and the rotation of those secrets, all of that is managed by Entra ID behind the scenes. This is thus more secure than a regular set of credentials that may be exposed, and even more secure than integrated authentication, thanks to the automatic rotation of the secret. So, managed identities enable token-based security without having to worry about secrets. Different types of managed identities exist. System-assigned managed identities are linked to one specific resource, like a database or an app service, while user-assigned managed identities can be linked to multiple resources. Diving into this in too much detail would lead us too far. Just know that this is the most secure option. But also know that it only works on Azure. A managed identity is an Azure-only thing. It cannot be enabled for resources outside of Azure. But for us that is no issue, because both our app service and our database are Azure resources. So what do we need to do to enable this? Well, we need to configure a managed identity for the app service we deployed our API to, and we need to grant it access to our database. We also need to adjust our code so it can connect to the database with that managed identity. And finally, we also need to ensure that we can still connect to our database from our local development environment. As I just mentioned, a managed identity is an Azure-only thing, and our local development environment is not on Azure. So there's a few things we need to do here. Let's start with enabling that managed identity. We are at level of our app service. I'm going to start with showing you one way of how to enable this via the UI, and that is by using a service connector. To create connections between Azure services, you can use that. So let's navigate to the service connector blade. You can already see a few connections here. those were created when we published the API. As mentioned, then we set up and used a service connection when publishing as well. But if we have a look at SQL database connector here and have a look at the connection string, we see that as expected it contains a username and password, as that is how we set it up. It's exactly that we want to change now. So let's add a new service connector, and as service type let's choose SQL database. We need to give our connection a name. It cannot contain dashes, so I'm simply going to use appdev scon for connection, dev we travel inspiration. I want to connect to our travel inspiration SQL server and our travel inspiration database. Let's click next. On the authentication tab we can now choose to use a system assigned managed identity. That is the one we want to choose, so let's click next. On the networking tab we state that a firewall rule must be configured, and then we can review it. This is all looking good. If I now click create on Cloud Shell down here, these Azure CLI commands will be executed. I could, by the way, also simply open the Azure CLI locally on my machine and copy paste those commands. As you remember, on Cloud Shell the Azure CLI is enabled as well, and I'm automatically logged in on Cloud Shell with the account I'm logged into on the portal, so the end result will be the same. Let's click create on Cloud Shell. What this does is enable the system assigned managed identity for our app service in case it didn't exist yet. It also adds a database user for that identity, and it grants all necessary privileges to that user. It also adds the connection string as an app setting. We will be able to find it in the app settings blade. And there we go. That was executed correctly. Let's refresh this. And here is our new connection. Now let's have a look at the app settings. A new app setting, Azure SQL connection string, was added. And if we have a look at that, we see that this connection string no longer contains any username or password, and authentication is set to Active Directory Managed Identity. So that's how a connection string that uses a managed identity looks. Now there is still one thing we need to do. As you can see, this application setting is named Azure Connection String. In our codebase, we can see that we use another key for the connection string. Our connection string is named Travel Inspiration DB Connection, and it is defined as a connection string and not as a regular app setting. So there's two things we can do now. We could change our code and local settings so it matches the app setting just created over on Azure, or we could keep our name and simply make sure that over on Azure, this Travel Inspiration DB connection string now uses that managed identity. I kind of like the way we organized our settings here, so I'm going to choose not to change the code. So let me copy the newly created connection string, and in the connections string part, let's open it. And let's change this connection string, which contains my user ID and password, so regular SQL authentication. This is the one that's currently used. Let's change this one to the new managed identity connection string. Let's click apply. Now let's click apply as well. Our application will be restarted. And from this moment on, we are using a managed identity to access our database from our app service. Let's test this. So I'm just going to send a request to get the itineraries. And there we go. This works as expected. But we potentially run into another issue now. Locally, we are using SQL Server authentication, so that is still enabled on our server. Remotely, we are using a managed identity. This is one of those typical things that may lead to issues. At a certain moment, you might accidentally sync your SQL Server authentication connection string to the cloud. Or the other way around, you may start using a managed identity connection string locally, and that won't work because a managed identity is an Azure only thing. There must be a way to make this a bit easier. Luckily, there is. But first, let me show you what the effect would be if we would use the managed identity connection string locally. That is easy enough to do. I'll just copy the remote connection string, this one here, as you can see, with managed identity enabled, and paste it as travel inspiration DB connection value. Right, let's save this and let's try running this locally. Let's save this without typos. 1 comma is sufficient. And let's send a request. So I'm now sending a local request. Host address route, as you can see, is set to my local host. And we hit an error. Managed identity credential authentication unavailable, this says. Well, that's rather annoying. But luckily there's an easy way to solve this, and that is by using default Azure credential. Let's have a look.